If you were born in the 13th century, you would have likely been a peasant. Maybe your father was a blacksmith, and so chances are you would have been a blacksmith too. Maybe something else, but your choices were limited. Back then, the idea of individual freedom was a completely foreign concept. You didn't pave your own way. You had a set path in front of you that you followed. You weren't faced with 1,000 different career options or business ideas or projects that you could pursue. Now, our world today looks a lot different to how it did back then, 700 years ago. The Renaissance and the Reformation led to individualism, capitalism, and the freedom that we can experience today, at least in the West. For the most part, this has been a good development, and I don't know about you, but I don't really want to go back to medieval society. However, there is a problem, and this problem is getting worse. See, this relentless drive towards individualism and freedom has resulted in a rapid expansion of choices, of options. For example, the modern college, university has more courses, more degrees, more potential paths than ever before. Instead of choosing between a dozen disciplines, you're faced with hundreds, if not thousands, of different education options. Instead of watching whatever is on television at the time, you have access to a dozen streaming platforms, and on those streaming platforms are hundreds of shows and movies, and it can be hard to choose which one to watch sometimes. That's why you have those moments, if you're like me, where you sit down and like you end up not watching anything because you just can't decide. Also, remote work has made location independence way more of a thing, and so you have people who work remotely and they can't decide where to live. They endlessly travel in search for that perfect location. Don't get me wrong, having no choice is bad, but having too much choice is also kind of bad. As Barry Schwartz writes in The Paradox of Choice, as the number of choices grows further, the negatives escalate until we become overloaded. At this point, choice no longer liberates, but debilitates. But it's not just that we have a multitude of choices in front of us. That is one part of the problem. The other part is that we have commitment phobia. We don't want to commit to one path, one business, one city, one goal, one person. We're constantly seeking variety and novelty, experimentation, kind of playing around with different options, but we never commit. As David Perel writes, Western culture over-indexes on novelty. Here's the thing, optionality is overrated. Commitment is underrated. And I didn't always used to believe this. I thought life in the modern world was about building up optionality, building up leverage. And to some extent that's true. You want to build up skills, you want to get an education, not necessarily a formal education, but you want to educate yourself, you want to create options, you want to build up capital so that you can choose the things that make the most sense and have the highest chance of success and will bring enjoyment and satisfaction to your life. However, optionality is only as useful insofar as it is used. If you never exercise the options in front of you, then what's the point of having them? We endlessly build optionality. We take multiple degrees, we acquire knowledge, skills, all in hope that one day we will put it to use. But this is a trap, the optionality trap. As Mihir Desai says, optionality is the state of enjoying possibilities without being on the hook to do anything. The building of optionality is instinctive in an age of abundance of choice and freedom. It just makes sense to do so, to give yourself options, but it's a poor way to deal with the problem of the paradox of choice and having too many options. Because when you have too many options, you don't solve that problem by building more options, even if it feels like the right thing to do at the time. You don't solve and you don't fix the anxiety that comes from freedom. As Kierkegaard once said, anxiety is the dizziness of freedom. And when you have too much of it and you have too much choice and no commitment, that's what you feel. You feel anxious. You feel unrooted. You feel like you don't have a foundation of sorts. What we need to do is commit, which sounds obvious, but we don't do it because we think optionality is better, or we think waiting is better, or that we need to think through it more. But the truth is, rewards accrue to those who commit. Imagine yourself in a hallway with dozens of doors to your left and your right. You can open any of these doors with ease. They're not locked. Some might require some jiggling, others will practically swing open for you, but you can enter any of these doors and enter the room behind these doors as you please. Behind each of these doors are rewards. When you enter a room, you get a reward. After some time, you realize that opening these doors to get the rewards is starting to lose its appeal. You enter each new room in hope of finding something that you're searching for, but ultimately coming up unfulfilled. This is life when you're not committed to anything. When you jump from project to project, business idea to business idea, date to date, city to city, in search of that elusive click, that moment that will make everything else make sense. Payoff that will make your endless browsing worthwhile. But of course, it never comes. At the end of a hallway is a locked door that you haven't really paid that much attention to because it's locked. It's hard to get past. You're not really sure how to get past it. There's something enticing about it. You wonder what's on the other side. And you start thinking that maybe it holds the answer that you're seeking. That door is only opened by the key of commitment. It's a key that can only be acquired through focus, exertion, consistency, stickability, and the foregoing of other options. And behind that locked door, possibilities that you could never imagine. Deep, satisfying rewards that you could never find in those other rooms that don't require commitment. A sense of purpose, clarity, and firmness that you were lacking beforehand. See, the person who commits over the long term puts themselves in a position where the rewards accrue to them. The writer who is committed to improving their craft day after day, year after year, gets certain rewards that the person who only writes sporadically when they feel like it will never get because they're not committed. The entrepreneur who spends 10 years on one business gets access to financial rewards that the entrepreneur who jumps from business idea to business idea will never get because they are not committed and they cannot compound. We should also commit because it pulls us out of the tensionless state that causes anxiety. As Viktor Frankl once wrote, mental health is based on a certain degree of tension, the tension between what one has already achieved and what one still ought to accomplish, or the gap between what one is and what one should become. What man actually needs is not a tensionless state, but rather the striving and struggling for a worthwhile goal, a freely chosen task. When you do commit, you can kind of relax into it. You don't have to worry about all these other options anymore. You've made a decision and you just stick to that and you can focus on the execution. And finally, this is a reframe that's important, which is that commitment produces clarity. We think that we need clarity before we make a commitment, and it does help to get some clarity, but ultimately you find clarity and purpose after you decide, after you commit. So how do you commit in this culture of open options, this culture of infinite browsing? And I'm glad I did so. The first thing you want to do to ramp up your commitment energy is to project yourself out into the future. This is what I had to do when I was stuck in a season of non-commitment, of overthinking, of analysis paralysis. I had to project myself forward and ask the question, what happens if I don't commit? You need to be real with yourself and honest with yourself. For me, when I asked myself that question, I realized that if I don't commit to something soon, I'm going to end up in the same spot a year from now, having achieved practically nothing. And so that pushed me to making a decision, a commitment on something that, quite frankly, I wasn't sure was going to work and I wasn't that clear about, but it forced me into action and it led me to a place where I gained more clarity. Ultimately, thinking through this question, this projecting out into the future, scared me of the consequences of non-commitment. And then, of course, there's the question of, well, what do I commit to? How do I figure out what to commit to? Well, it's a hard question to answer. The first thing I would say is that any commitment is better than no commitment, generally speaking. You don't want to spend a decade of your life swimming around in the sea of optionality only to get out and realize you haven't built anything, you haven't compounded, you haven't done any great work. There's something to be said about committing to what you think are the right things without falling into the trap of maximization or trying to find the perfect option, but you don't always know precisely what the right thing is. Maybe you do, and the thing that's stopping you is just fear. In that case, it's a different question. How do I overcome the fear? But a lot of you watching this might just not be sure what to commit to. And in that case, a helpful principle to remember is to focus on making the decisions right, not just making the right decisions. The decision you make becomes right over time through your commitment. So you might decide to start a business and you get off on the wrong foot. But because of your commitment, you adapt, you pivot, and the decision that you made initially, while it went a little bit messy at the start, becomes right over time. Your starting point wasn't ideal, but after course correction, you're in a good spot. But you can't course correct if you're not on a course, if you're not committed to something. But let me share 2 principles for helping you figure out what to commit to, and then 2 more principles for actually taking the action of commitment. First principle for figuring out what to commit to is to stop hoping for absolute certainty. In 2009, Derek Sivers wrote an article titled Hell Yeah or No. He states that if you're overcommitted or you're too scattered, then you shouldn't take on anything new unless you feel hell yeah about it, unless you feel excited and you really want to do it. This is a good heuristic if you're over committed. If you already have too much on your plate and you're already committed to a bunch of different things, then yes, you should say no to practically everything unless it's a mind-blowing opportunity or you really, really want to do it. The problem is many people misunderstood this and they applied the heuristic to their entire life, which you cannot do because it's not that simple. If you always wait until you feel hell yeah about something, then there's a significant chance that you just never commit because you never feel that excited about something. Life is not that simple. Sometimes you have to do stuff that you're not hell yeah about to get to the point where you can be hell yeah about it. Many people make the error of thinking that they can achieve some sense of absolute certainty when making a decision between 2 or more options. That if they just think it through enough, then they'll experience some sort of divine clarity. This does happen, and when it does happen, it's a beautiful thing. But most of the time, it doesn't happen. Most of the time, you can increase your level of confidence, you can increase certainty to some extent, but there's always going to be some doubt, there's always going to be some uncertainty remaining, and you need to commit anyway. The more you can get comfortable with forging ahead and embracing commitment in uncertainty, the faster you will progress. Here's a powerful mental reframe for you. You don't want absolute certainty. You want confidence, but confidence is not the same thing as certainty. Uncertainty, at least a little bit of it, sparks the activation energy for pursuing great work and embracing worthwhile commitment. Playing a video game where you know everything that's going to happen with absolute certainty is not a fun game to play. Watching a movie that you've watched 10 times in the last few months is going to lose its spark, right? You know what's going to happen. There's no novelty. There's nothing new. There's nothing around the corner that you're not sure about. When you always do things you're certain about, they are usually things that aren't challenging. When you're always certain, you aren't operating at your edge. This is how I ended up in my season of stasis, as I call it, years ago in business. We were doing the same things over and over that I knew would work with certainty, and it was fine, but it was easy and it was boring. I lacked challenge. I wasn't really trying to grow the business. I was staying in the comfort zone, doing what I knew was certain. But that comfort zone gets uncomfortable quite quickly. The second principle for figuring out what to commit to is to strip back inauthentic desires as much as you can. The question of how do you know what you authentically want is a hard question to answer. When I was 18, I thought I wanted to be a world touring DJ and producer. That was my dream. But when I look back, I realized it's not what I wanted at all. I was attracted to the flashy lifestyle, the fame, the potential money, but it's not what I truly wanted. It's not what I authentically desired. And ultimately, it's what I decided against when I pursued an online business instead. My desire to be a world touring artist was mimetically influenced by what I was seeing around me on social media, on the internet, and so forth. You don't want to get trapped in an overthinking loop where you endlessly question whether your desire is authentic or not. You can do that for months, years on end, and it won't really help you. A better practice instead is to just get close enough. And you can do that by stripping back and eliminating the clearly non-authentic desires. This can be done through introspection with Socratic questioning, critical feedback from friends, and practical experimentation. Here are some good questions to ask yourself. Do I actually desire this, or do I just desire what it looks like on the outside? For example, the life of a tech startup founder might look great until you realize that they're doing 80-hour weeks, they're stressed, and the chance of success is very low. What is the core daily work that's involved, and can I see myself doing it for years on end? If you like the image of a successful salesperson, but you don't like the idea of picking up the phone and doing 20, 30, 40, 50 calls a day, then maybe it's not an authentic desire. If I end up hating this, what would be the reason? Is there something external that prompted this desire recently? Maybe it's a book, a podcast, a tweet that you read. You want to analyze that and make sure that it's not just recency bias. If someone gave me $1 billion right now, would I still pursue this? If not, what would I do instead? Secondly, it's helpful to get critical feedback from people you know, from friends and from peers that are honest with you. One thing that pushed me to lean into writing and YouTube more than other ideas and desires that I had was that I had multiple people confirm that not only was I pretty good at coming up with ideas and presenting them, but also that I found it much easier to do the work involved than other people, and that I also enjoyed work that others did not. For many of my friends, writing is a means to an end, and for me, it's an intrinsically enjoyable craft, like act. I like doing it, and I would do it even if I was a billionaire. The thing that feels like play to you but work to others is probably quite close to what your authentic desire is. And so you want to think about that and lean into it. All right, so what about actually taking the action of commitment? Let's talk about commitment and stasis. Much of our hesitancy to commit to something is simply due to our fundamental desire to remain in stasis. Commitment involves action, movement, change, discomfort. And because stasis is the default mode, you want to conserve energy, there's an inertia that comes from stasis that's hard to break out of. And this is why the longer you've been in a state of analysis paralysis or overthinking, the harder it is to break out of. You've conditioned yourself to operate in a certain way. And so each time an opportunity comes up to commit to something, instead of intentionally and rapidly thinking through it with a forward-leaning, action-oriented frame of mind, you dwell on it passively for weeks or months on end. You've built a mental habit of doing this, and it's hard to reverse it. There are 3 ways to break out of this type of stasis and commit to something. The first is the one that you cannot plan for. It's when something external happens to you that forces you out of stasis. It could be something positive. Might be an opportunity that comes across your lap that's so damn good and so obvious that you can't help but commit to it. Or it could be negative. It could be a traumatic event like a family member dying or an injury that gives you a wake-up call. The second way is to force yourself into a position where you gain enough commitment energy to escape the stasis you're in. Moving to a new city, quitting your job, embedding accountability into your work and life are a few ways of doing this. But the problem with this approach is that it requires commitment in and of itself. If you're a chronic overthinker, a procrastinator, and you struggle with commitment, then are you really going to commit to a new city? Probably not. But it can be helpful if you have commitment energy in one area, like moving location, but you're struggling with something else, like starting a new business. Commitment isn't just a one-off event. It's a habit. It's a way of living, a way of operating. As we've learned, it's not all that easy to just flick a switch and turn yourself into a person of commitment all of a sudden. One strategy is to make atomic commitments, as Pete Davis calls them in his book Dedicated, the case for commitment in an age of infinite browsing. He says that small commitments that are pursued to great depths can explode outwards. So you don't have to start by making some grand 5-year commitment. You can start by committing to a project that takes a few days to complete. If you haven't stuck with or finished something in a long time, then the simple act of committing to something small will give you momentum and confidence, which can allow you to make bigger commitments. As you're making these atomic commitments, you want to consider the idea of progressively overloading your commitment muscle. Just like you get stronger at the gym by incrementally adding weight to the barbell, you get stronger at commitment by incrementally increasing the strength, the depth, and the length of your commitment. So you might start by making a commitment to just do something for 1 week, one project. Then you might extend that to a month. And then you might extend it to 3 or 6 months. And by that point, you'll be operating on a fundamentally different level with a fundamentally different mentality. So to wrap up this video, I have 4 words for you. Stop browsing. Start committing. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.